Which CRT is your favorite? Well, there are so many of them, but of course there are things that are very common between CRTs. First of all, it's their native resolution. They're not tied to a grid like modern displays, LCD or OLED. Also, they have zero blow because they don't operate with the same technique as sample and hold. The electron beam basically hits a spot, it lights up instantly and then fades to black. Now, what your brain does is actually bridging the gap, and because the screen is black for most of the frame duration, your eye doesn't smear the motion. This is physically impossible for an LCD to replicate perfectly, and I made a video about it yesterday. There's also zero input lag because there's no digital processing involved. All CRT display draw their image line by line, top to bottom. And the reason, by the way, why light guns, for example, work on this display and not, for example, even on the most expensive OLED display, as the gun relies on the timing of that drawing beam. Now, there's also the professional CRTs, the PVM, the BVMs, compared to consumer CRTs. Consumer CRTs have around 300 to 450 TV lines compared to PVM that has around between 600 and 1000 lines. Also, the electron beam is laser thin on PVMs, for example, that it draws the lines so precisely that they don't even touch each other. This creates this kind of a thick black gaps between the scan lines, again the gap between the color line, and it reveals every single pixel flaw. Now, CRT, of course, depends. There are varieties, but in general, consumer CRTs has a fatter, more thicker electron beam. So it paints thick lines that overlap slightly. So this helps blends together pixels. So it's good for transparency effect, and also makes the image look smoother. Now, this effect can be seen very clearly, especially when you see, for example, this effect, this waterfall and water effect. I'm going to show you more another example in a moment. And also look at Sonic's look compared to when it's off and just kind of pixelated on the LCD, compared to using shaders. And different ones, of course, those who give it kind of more smoother three-dimensional look, which is more similar to what you get with the consumer CRT. And also depends on the cable. Some cables create a more smoother look. Some people prefer it, some people don't like it. Or you can have kind of a more prominent scan lines, which you're going to see it more clearly, for example, on large Trinitron display, and especially when you're using PVM displays, professional displays. Now, games back in the days were designed for consumer TVs with their flaws. Specifically, this is why if you want to get a more authentic, like as the developer intended, viewing experience, or you just like it better, you probably will prefer going with, well, depends if you're buying a CRT, a consumer CRT, and maybe just stay with a certain cable, not go, for example, with SCART RGB that can lead to sharper visuals, and not get, for example, the scanline that some people seeing, for example, as something like, you know, kind of filtered on top of the image, and you just kind of take out from the smooth image. It can actually lead to very jagged edges at certain in certain games or certain parts of the game. And for some, even it can be fatiguing. Actually, back then, most consumer TVs use shadow mask, which is kind of used as a metal sheet with tiny holes, dots, that create this honeycomb pattern that looks organic and soft. PVMs, for example, use aperture grid like Sony PVMs. They use a frame with vertical wires, stripes, and there are no horizontal breaks. And because of that, by the way, it can lead to brighter image because, again, it blocks less of the electron beam, resulting in a brighter, higher contrast picture. Now, there's no one size fits all here. Some prefer actually playing on several displays, actually, you know, maybe bigger or even smaller, and PVM or BVM or consumer CRT, depends on the game they're actually playing. I've read many people are saying they just dislike PVM because for certain games, like for example a Chrono Trigger, which I'm actually playing right now, by the way, on Steam, because the PVM separates this beautiful pixel art into a grid, and the consumer CRT blends the art back into kind of a painting like, which is how most of us remember playing it. For example, one example is, for example, when you can water effect and waterfall effect, even you just play around with some dithering effect, you can see that sharp display it's just going to look odd, weird, kind of just straight line just moving, and depends, some maybe like it, I personally don't. But when dithering is applied, even artificially, you can see suddenly things just look a bit kind of more how they look realistically, but of course presented in the beautiful classic games are designed. But the same goes to everything. Everything just becomes kind of more 3D dimensional, like this kind of depth. It doesn't look flat, it doesn't look like a comic book. Same goes to highlights, then even shadows. They look like kind of a jagged edges. They look like shadows. Then, by the way, goes to the bloom. Some people praise, for example, PVM is not having bloom. I say on the opposite. Actually, bloom helps them quite a lot. In the 90s, game developers knew that CRTs were well imperfect and the bright pixel would bleed into dark ones. So what they did, they exploited this flaw to create effects that are physically impossible on a sharp modern display. For example, it turns patterns into transparencies using dithering. So what they did, for example, because they couldn't afford real transparency processing, instead they used a checkboard pattern of pixels. 1 pixel on, 1 pixel off. Now, without bloom, you see harsh checkboard grid. So it looks like kind of a mesh fence. With bloom, the bright pixel expand into the dark gaps and the checkboard effect melts into a single semi-transparent sheet. This is, for example, Sonic the Hedgehog. So this is a waterfall in front of Sonic. So if you play it on an LCD, you're gonna see something similar to this. But you see I'm playing here with different shaders and changing them, and then you can see this just blends differently, so it just doesn't look like really straight lines. Alright, so this is, for example, without filter, a complete mess, and let's apply other shaders. You can see it just looks different, looks like kind of more watery, right? Everything appears more three-dimensional. Here we just totally ruined the image. You definitely see that this is not how the developer intended it to look. Now, you might like it this way, fine. I'm just pointing out, of course, the differences. So you can see very clearly. Also, the middle is supposed to be less because there are two kind of more water in the sides and kind of less in the middle. This is like a perfect example of try to achieve some kind of transparency. And although again both of them are on LCD, I'm kind of try to simulate it with all the already pre-made shaders, and you can clearly see the effect. Now, when it comes to text, just so you know, there are some games that actually activate, for example, forward eye, for example, just for menu, so text will be clearer. Depends, of course, on the console and the game. But I think by now you kind of get the point. And if somebody tells you they don't like the sharp look, for example, maybe on PVA, maybe don't like playing with, for example, RGB SCART cable, they prefer, you know, the one that produce less, more softer look. I think you can understand why. Understand the reason. Doesn't mean that your preference is same to them. Now, of course, I gave you kind of more extreme view of it, and of course, the difference will depends, of course, on various factors, both on the type of CRT, if you're using consumer or PVM or BVM, what cable you are using, what games you are actually playing, also maybe also the where you actually decide to play, maybe it's a bright or dark environment and so on, the distance from the display. But when again people said that games were designed for those consumer TVs and also not for these high quality cables that we have today, and this is what most people use and why developers actually optimize their games for that technologies, I think you can understand why. But for me, because I really enjoy experimenting and I want to test it out, maybe some games will be better it depends on the technology, also different cables and stuff. I'm going to have both PVM, also BVM later, and also the CRT. So any interesting finding, I want to share with you. I want to hear your opinion, by the way, which one you prefer, the reasons why, which games, which console you think it actually worked best based on your favorite art style result. Let me know in the comment section below. We discuss it there. Thanks for watching. Also consider subscribing. I would appreciate it a lot. See you on the next video. Cheers.